My fellow Ethiopians, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to start by wishing each and every one of you a very happy millennium on this occasion in which we are sending off the second and welcoming the third millennium as of Maskaram 1, 2000 Amata Mehret, Anno Domini, or Year of the Lord. Naturally, I would have been much happier if I could have joined you personally in these national festivities and answered as many questions as you might have on any of the points I'm going to raise over the next few minutes. But under the circumstances, this was the best arrangement we could make with our community leader, Dr. Urko, whereby you can see me all intact with my best Nkutatash refinements, my heavy reading glasses, and my gorgeous, now gray, fast receding gofere. So you can see me, even if I cannot. And thus, we joyfully celebrate together our millennium. Malcolm Nkutatash, happy millennium. Malcolm Shamet. The first point we should raise and talk about is that we Ethiopians are the only Africans south of the Sahara who are observing this millennium. Do let us contemplate for a brief moment what all this tells us about our history and Ethiopia's place in the history of the world. Of course, we do not have enough time to go into great details on such festive occasion. But I would like to cite some of the most important facts. To start with, remember that the first Christian church in Black Africa was established in the ancient kingdom of Ethiopia, which, with its capital city at Aksum and its major Red Sea ports at Adulis, was one of the strongest powers in the region of the Near and the Middle East. This took place in the beginning of the 4th century, about the same time as the Roman Empire accepted Christianity. Long before that, over those distant centuries when Old Testament prophets and other biblical Greek and Roman writers repeatedly mentioned Ethiopia and the Ethiopians with unreserved romantic respect and admiration, our ancestors had already developed a writing system of their own. And with the introduction of Christianity, they set out to translate gradually all the books of the Holy Bible and other Christian service books into Ge'ez, which is still the basic language of the Ethiopian Church. Thus, at a time when much of Europe was still pagan and practically unknown, Ethiopia had gone a long way into being an important and integral part of the Judeo-Christian world, centered on the Mediterranean Sea and the Levant. It was following that crucial development, in short, that together with many other cultural elements with which I will not tire you today, our ancestors adopted the early Christian calendar system from the Coptic Church, which we have kept alive for over 1,675 years. Even before the introduction of Christianity into Ethiopia, however, a few stone inscriptions indicate that some calendar system was already in use by the ancient Ethiopians. Given the early connections with Egypt, it will not be surprising if that calendar system was related to the famous one which the ancient Egyptians had developed as far back as 3,000 years BC. But there is no doubt that the calendar we now have was ultimately derived from that system, since we have adapted it from the Copts, the direct descendants of the ancient Egyptians, and who still retain many basic features from ancient times. The most important feature, which we also share, is New Year Day, Nkutatash, on Maskaram 1, equivalent to the month of Tot 1 in the Coptic calendar. This day became the holiest festival of the year for the ancient Egyptians, because it was the day when the Nile River flooding, which was the source of their prosperity and civilization, reached its highest level. This was such an important event in their life that they also adopted this day as their New Year day. The system we received was a version of the solar calendar, which was finally refined and instituted in 1000 BC. According to this system, the year consisted of 365 days divided into 12 months and 30 days each, and an additional 5 days which they dedicated for a series of ritual festivities at the end of every year. From this, their descendants, the Copts, later developed their year of 13 months, 12 of them having 30 days each, and the last one, which they called the little month, consisting of only 5 days or 6 days in a leap year. This was not very different from the one the Roman Emperor Augustus later imposed upon his subjects. This is known as the Julian Calendar, because it was first inaugurated by the famous Julius Caesar back in 46 BC. It was this final version of the Coptic system, fully calibrated with the system of the Julian calendar, that eventually came to us. But it is apparent that the idea of a year of 12 months was not new for the Ethiopians at the time. They already had their own 12 months, each with its own name, completely unrelated to the words the Copts, the Greeks, or the Romans used for their months. However, we still do not have any evidence of how our forefathers came about with the names of our 12 months, Maskaram, Tiqim, Tidar, and so on. But they are a clear evidence for a well-established Ethiopian calendar of 12 months, even in more ancient times. It may be that it was only the idea of organizing the 5 to 6 superfluous days at the end of the year into a separate calendar unit that was new to the Ethiopians. Because this idea was new to them, they did not have a name of their own for it, but they rejected the idea of calling it the little months as the Copts did, because it was inexact to give such a few days the exalted name of a month. And instead, the independent-minded Ethiopians looked for a more rational name and adopted the Greek term pagumin, which precisely means the forgotten days. For our tourism organization, however, the term 13 months of sunshine has served as a beautiful banner over the years. It was in the naming of the days of the week where the Ethiopians demonstrated their special creativity. The basis for the names they gave to the days of the week were the first 2 chapters of the first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis. I'm sure you all remember your reading of these chapters of the book of Genesis. There we have the famous story of God creating the world in 6 days and resting on the 7th. The names our ancestors gave to the days of the week are a beautiful celebration of those 6 days of creation and the divine rest on the 7th. The first day they simply called Ehud, which is related to the Giz word Ahadu, 1, and just means first, thus perpetually honoring the first day of creation. The second day was named Sanui, in Amharic adapted to Senyo, both of which are derived from the Giz word for second. The third day was called Salus, third in Giz. In Amharic, this was modified into Maksenyo, which means Magist Senyo, the day after Senyo, Yesenyo Magist. The fourth day was named Rabu, meaning fourth in Giz, and slightly modified into Rob in Amharic. The fifth was called Hamus, fifth in Giz. But to the sixth day, they gave the special name Arb, which is related to the Giz word for dusk, or setting of the sun, and Mi'rab, which means where the sun sets. Why did they do this? They did this in relation to the 7th day, on which God is said to have taken his divine rest. after he created the universe. As we all know, this day of the divine rest is highly venerated by the people of the Old Testament, as is known with great devotion as the Sabbath. Our ancestors simply adopted the name and called this day Sanbat in Ge'ez, Sabbath, Sanbat. And Arb is thus the day of the setting of the sun before the Sabbath, or the eve of Sabbath day, Yesenbet Wazema, a day on which all believers get ready for the special ritual celebrations which took place on the day of the Sabbath itself. The respect of the Ethiopians for Sanbet was so great that they later started to call Sunday, which is believed to be the day of the resurrection of the Lord, by the same name, Sanbet. This meant that the Christians of Ethiopia ended up observing 2 Sanbet days in 1 week. To avoid the obvious confusion between the 2 Sanbet days, they called the 7th day Qadamit Sanbet, the original Sabbath day, and Sunday Daharit Sanbet, the latter Sabbath day. It is from this final development that we have the name Qadame, Qadamit, for Saturday in Amharic. This particular way of naming the days of the week is quite unique to Ethiopia and testifies to both their creativity and proverbial sense of independence. On this subject of our calendar and its computation by the scholars of the Ethiopian Church, we have the extremely useful book which our own Professor Getachew Haile of St. John's University at Collegeville, Minnesota, has recently published in Amharic. The book is entitled ባህር ሐሳብ የዘመን ቆጠራ ቅርሳችን ከታሪክ ማስታወሻ ጋራ. The book is entitled ባህር ሐሳብ. It is imperative for everyone to read and possess a copy of this book. It is an excellent contribution based on many years of very close investigation of the most original Ethiopic sources we have on our history calendar. Even if Professor Getachew has tried his best to make his presentation as simple as possible, however, the subject matter is itself a very complicated one. For our traditional scholars, however, they have it generally committed to memory, and they use it to compute the Ethiopian church calendar. Every well-educated priest worth his salt goes through this ritual at his local church every year on Unqutatash Day. It may actually be that many of you have already observed Father Michael doing it every year at the Church of Debre Zion Medanalam here in Chicago. A big bushel full of small symbolical samples of the local agricultural products of the year is ceremoniously placed under the feet of the church father. He first prays on the collection and gives thanks to God for his blessing of the harvest of the year. He then proceeds with his computation. While the church fathers are thus engaged in this process of calendar computation, we say, ባህር ሐሳብ እያወጡ ነው. There is another very important item which our fathers use as a starting point for their computation. According to an ancient tradition, still maintained by the Ethiopian Church and its fellow Eastern churches, Christ was born exactly 5,500 years after the creation of the world. That would mean that he was born in 5,500 Amity Alam, year of the world, year since the creation of the world. Now this is the basis for yet another calendar. Despite the views of modern astronomers and physicists who have concluded that the universe may be as old as 15 billion years, the date today, which is 2000 Amata Mehret, since the birth of Christ, is also 7,500 Amata Alam, 7,500 year of the world since the creation of the world. You must have all heard the expression, "Abet የስምንተኛው ሺህ ልጆች." My mother always used this phrase whenever we made her angry at home. The legend surrounding ስምንተኛው ሺህ is very entertaining and colorful, but we obviously do not have enough time for it. We are all የስምንተኛው ሺህ ልጆች, and since we are only in the middle of ስምንተኛው ሺህ, we will still have a lot of time to discuss it on other occasions. I introduced the Amet Alam calendar because, as I said earlier, the date in Amet Alam is always the starting point of the complex computing process. I say complex largely because the computation has to combine the principles of the lunar year with those of the solar. It also has to take into account a total of 7 different cycles, both astronomical, like the cycles of days, months, and years, and 4 other basically non-astronomical ones. Moreover, the computation involves the 4 arithmetic operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, all of which our fathers easily handled through pure memory. Their major objective in the computation is, of course, to establish and determine all the moving festivals of the year, like Easter Day, which always has to fall on Sunday. The very vital 3-day fast of Nineveh, Yenenoe Tzom, and the other fasting seasons of the year. The details of the actual computation process can be found in Professor Getachew Haile's seminar work, where he guides us step by step how to come out with all the moving feasts and fasting seasons of the year. You notice I have described Yenenoe Tzom as very vital. This is because once you sort out when Yenenoe Tzom starts, you can easily determine the others by the number of days which separates them from the first day of Yenenoe Tzom. There is actually a special table with these numbers listed one after the other, which you can use to establish the desired dates. You may think that all this is only the calendar of the church, but you must realize that the civil calendar is only based on it. It is also derived from it. And until very recently, the only specialists who could compute and determine both the church and the civil calendar were always our church fathers. Our church fathers also have another calendar, which is purely religious and particularly useful only to scholars who have to deal with and date ancient historical documents. It's called Amity Samaitat, the year of the Martyrs. It is given this name in commemoration of the worst persecution of Christians during the reign of the powerful Roman Emperor Diocletian. It was in those terrible days that most of our model Christian heroes were tortured and killed, and whose short biographies our church has registered in the Sinkasar, which is always read after the service of Mass on the relevant days, and for whom tabots and churches have been dedicated, great spiritual role models like Georgis, Mercurius, Theodros, Galaudius, and many others. This calendar starts as of the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Diocletian, and the date today in that calendar is 1723 Amity Samaitat, 1723 Amity Samaitat. It is apparent that the original uncertainties and disputations about the exact date of the birth of the Lord mentioned earlier are directly or indirectly responsible for the 7 to 8 years difference between the calendar years of the West and ours. In the 16th century, yet another calendar reform was instituted in the Catholic Church. In 1582, the Roman Archbishop Pope Gregory was advised by his astronomer scientists that there were a number of errors in the Julian calendar, and the reform was long overdue. Among the Pope's many changes, there was one in which he just added 10 days to a particular date of the year and ordered that it be followed by everyone afterwards. At first, there was a lot of resistance to it, even among members of the Catholic community. But now, the Gregorian calendar has become a world standard. Of course, the Pope's decree did not apply to us and the Copts, but it still created the 11 days difference between the beginnings of the Ethiopian and Western months. Happily, these differences of a few years or days are relatively minor in terms of 1,000 years, in terms of a millennium, for which our common starting point is the same, the coming of the Lord Jesus. The West preceded us by only 8 years in starting their millennium. But hurrah, here we are today, we are catching up with them, with our own millennium. Happy millennium. Malcolm Nkutatash, Malcolm Shamet. My fellow Ethiopians, let us now take a few moments and reflect and consider that very few modern countries of the world today can put up a claim over a millennium and a half years of continuous existence as a major regional power. But our Ethiopia can, and there is absolutely no doubt about this. Just forget the many sarcasms and laughter we have all noted since the fall of Abba Janhoe, when 3,000 years or 2,000 years of history were raised. Those were only coordinated acts of propaganda by several liberation organizations and aimed at belittling Ethiopia for their own political agendas. However, despite many transformations in our history over the last 2 millennia, we have been able to maintain the unbroken continuity of our ancient Ethiopian state and the full integrity of the Ethiopian Church. It is essentially these fundamental historical facts that are enabling us today to celebrate with full dignity and spiritual pride the glorious memory of millenniums past and the advent of yet another millennium. It is of course legitimate for our critical, progressive, and rightly impatient youth today to ask, what have we done with all these thousands of years? But this question has to be asked as it can only be answered in the right historical perspective. Here tonight, I can introduce you to only very few highlights of the impressive performances of our ancestors over the last 2 millennia in the briefest possible way. As a matter of fact, the historical record of our Ethiopian ancestors over the last 2 millennia has been one of the brightest in the whole world. During large part of the first millennium, our ancient Ethiopian state, with its capital at Aksum, had already dominated the whole region of the Red Sea, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa. And it was considered for some time as one of the 4 great powers of the period, in a list that included the Greek, Byzantine Empire in the west and the Persian Empire in the east. During this period, it controlled much of the international trade of the whole Red Sea. It actually extended its administration over parts of the southern Arabian Peninsula for a time. Its alliance was greatly desired by both Byzantium and Persia, and what will be of great significance for its future development, this state also had a firm foothold in the interior territories and among the diverse populations of northern, central Ethiopia in particular. On the whole, however, just like all other great civilizations of those ancient times, much of the physical records of those achievements can only be seen today in the refined obelisks of Aksum, many ruins of ancient royal palaces, towns, seaports, and other rich archaeological sites. But the most living legacies of those formative times which you have preserved and further developed are many and most impressive. To name only a few, we have the only ancient alphabet and writing system in Africa, which has undergone significant developments to accommodate many diverse linguistic communities and which has continued to be in use over the last 2 millennia. The developed Ge'ez literature, of which unfortunately only surviving samples are well preserved in the rich collections of our own monasteries at home and in famous libraries in Rome, Paris, London, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and here in the United States as the monastic microfilms library of St. John's at Collegeville, where Professor Getachew has been cataloging them for us over the last 3 decades. And then the calendar, of which the history we briefly considered above. The fine paintings, the beautiful Yared music and religious dance, and the ancient beliefs, practices, and the legal system of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. And finally, from the very beginning, our ancient Ethiopian state has been based on a solid society of many nationalities, speaking diverse languages, having their own religious practices, and to a very large extent, managing their own local affairs. The overall leadership during those ancient times was clearly in the hands of power groups whose official and working language was Ge'ez. Much of the cultural traits of that society and its state structure were essentially preserved and passed almost intact to the second millennium. The second millennium started on Maskaram 1,000 years ago. Look, Yazare and Amet. This was the early part of what is known in history as the medieval period. By then, a number of things had changed in international power relations in the whole region of the Mediterranean Sea, the Nile Valley, and the Red Sea. Ethiopia's former friends and allies no longer exercised decisive influence in the area. New and stronger powers had emerged in the Arabian Peninsula and in Egypt. And as a result, our Ethiopian state, with its capital at Aksum, had been considerably weakened. It no longer had direct control of its ancient coastal provinces, and it had completely lost its overall supremacy over the Red Sea. But this only meant that the state now had to focus on its inland territories, with its capital gradually moving to several places further to the south and under new dynamic leadership groups who were better in tune with the ever-changing local conditions. By about 1200 AD, the capital had moved to Lalibela, which soon flourished as a renewed cultural and religious center under the leadership of Christian Agau elites. The beautiful architectural achievements and of the numerous rock churches of that period are still considered to be among the world's finest cultural heritage today. And they are protected by a special budgetary allocation from UNESCO, the United Nations Organization for Education, Science and Culture. The medieval Ethiopian state of the second millennium was different from its original form in Aksum in one important way. It was no longer based on the ancient network of urban centers and port towns with relatively large populations. It had now become a veritable African rural society. There were practically no large towns worth the name. There were only sizable country residences of the elite, of the ruling elites, and famous weekly markets held at crucial sites throughout the country and attended by thousands of local and international merchants, and which were interconnected by a network of well-protected trade routes. The international merchants, the majority of which were Arabs and Indians, came from mainly the ports of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean. These markets generated considerable amounts of revenue to the ruling groups, who continuously vied among themselves for the control of the valuable trade routes. This constant struggle with the control of the trade routes provided a central theme for much of the destructive wars and violence recorded in the history of the country during the second millennium. Since the largest amount of the volume of trade originated from the interior parts of the region, the major ruling groups of the central highland provinces, led by the Christian Amhara, had a great advantage in this struggle. They moved the political center of gravity still further south, first to their own homeland of Amhara, now Wollo, and then to what is today the region of Sheba, which they had also made their own. The new leadership provided the ancient monarchy with a fresh biblical ideology and symbolisms, among which the most glamorous was the legend of the romantic relations between the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon. They not only claimed to be the descendants of this romance and boldly claimed themselves the Solomonic dynasty, but they also decreed that no one who did not belong to this Solomonic family may occupy the Ethiopian royal throne. They raised huge armies of fighting men from their vast territories and maintained a stable imperial system for several centuries. They corresponded with and sent diplomatic envoys to Europeans and other Mediterranean powers, and their exploits were widely known and sung throughout the medieval period. This was indeed a very strong dynasty, and they dominated a large part of our history throughout the second millennium. The Emperor Haile Selassie was the last sovereign of that dynasty, which had a mastery over Ethiopian history for a total of over 750 years. It is important to note, however, that to a very large extent, the dynasty could enjoy such a wide-ranging supremacy only because it was successful in creating a wide-ranging supremacy, in creating a series of strong alliances with a large number of nationalities throughout the northern, central, and southern Ethiopia. The princes of the royal family purposely intermarried with the ruling families of the major allied nationalities, and the offspring of such marriages were placed in leading positions within the state structure of government. It is clear also from ancient times onwards, all these nationalities basically enjoyed the freedom to speak their own languages, to observe their own traditional religious practices, to manage their own local affairs, and they widely participated in the administrative and military leadership of the country at various levels. By the 7th century, the Oromo, one of the largest populations in the country, had long been involved in the historic dynamics of the process of interaction and integration so characteristic of Ethiopian society since ancient times. As a result, they had made a profound cultural and demographic impact in almost all our ancestors in southern, central, and even northern Ethiopia, especially in the northern parts of the kingdom, where it had its center. The Oromo had gradually begun to take active socio-cultural, political, and military leadership roles within the overall Ethiopian state structure, particularly in Sheba, Wollo, Bagamdir, and Gojam. During much of the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Oromo princes of Wallo were also an integral part of the royal court of Gondar. While their beautiful daughters vanquished the sturdy hearts of many an influential member of the royal family, the leading Oromo princes of Wallo were the major power group who actually ensured the constitutional existence of the Solomonic monarchy until the rise to power of the Emperor Theodorus. The last 2 centuries of the second millennium were very crucial in the formation of a positive image of Ethiopia throughout the rest of Africa and the wider African diaspora in the Caribbean islands and the Americas in general. With European and American missionaries spreading the stories of the Old and New Testaments in these regions, the repeated mention of Ethiopia and the Ethiopians in the various books of the Bible greatly impressed these people, who gradually began to associate themselves with Ethiopia and the peoples of Ethiopia as an important avenue for constructing a biblical identity for themselves. With European imperialism asserting itself over Africa, only Ethiopia effectively resisted the imposition of white hegemony over the continent. The dignified challenge of as Theodorus put up against British arrogance at Magdala in 1868, the persistent struggle of As Johannes against Arab and Italian imperialism, and his heroic death at Metemma in 1889, and the impressive victory of the Ethiopian forces led by As Menelik at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where they completely crushed the Italian army. All these dramatic events in the 19th century Ethiopia were a great source of pride and spiritual satisfaction for all Africans and the African diaspora throughout the world. And they had a great role in the creation and growth of the Rastafarian movement, the establishment of many independent Ethiopianist or Zionist churches by Africans and Americans of African origin, and the general black outcry during Mussolini's fascist war and brief occupation of Ethiopia, when a black patriot is said to have joined the Ethiopian forces against the fascists at different fronts. The last century of the second millennium is also coming to an end today, and we can legitimately claim it as our own century. Being just over 72 years old, this last century is only 28 years older than me. This means, of course, that I have lived through much of this century myself. It is my view that the brightest star of our century rose for us in 1908, when As Menelik decided to establish a modern school at Arat Kilo. Since most of the students of the school at that time were the children of aristocrats, their meals were sent daily from the imperial kitchen for quite some time. This great personal interest of the palace in Ethiopian schools continued unabashed, quite beyond the middle of the century. Our meals then may not have come from the palace any longer, but still Ababa Janhoy often visited us at mealtime in some schools and in our colleges with loads of delicious seasonal fruits. We joyfully walked in line to Ganna Darash every year to receive Christmas gifts from his own hands, and we always marched with pride and personal triumph to his palace at the end of every school year to collect special prizes from his own hands whenever we excelled in our classes. This happy state of affairs was drastically brought to an end by the daring Mengistu Nwai brothers and the week of the so-called የክቡር ዘበኛ አመፅ of 1960. The events of that week radically changed the rapport between Abba Janoy and his precious students. During these crucial days, school and university students decisively stood for change. They wildly demonstrated in support of the Kubur Zawanya rebel forces, and for the first time, they publicly denounced the emperor. The die was cast, and the relations between students and the palace only went from bad to worse. The leaders of the attempted coup d'etat were soon hanged and done away with, but students enthusiastically and openly assumed the leadership of the struggle for change. It became ritual to have school, college stoppages, sometimes twice or 3 times a year, and numerous other noisy demonstrations. The revolution of February 1974 was no doubt the climax of those persistent and heroic efforts of Ethiopian students. The lack of mature civilian leadership and the complete absence of strong civil institutions enabled the military to easily hijack the revolution and led to the horrific tragedy of the dark days, during which we lived in absolute terror and simply watched thousands of dedicated Ethiopian youth sacrificing their lives for change and democratic governance. At the end of the dark days, the advent of EPDRF in 1991 promised fundamental changes in this regard. Seen in a long historical perspective, we need to recognize that every regime has had some positive achievements to its credit. We of course owe our entire modern state superstructure to the days of Abba Janoy, the Emperor Haile Selassie, who in his old age became, however, absolutely insensitive to the needs for further political development. And he was, as such, continuously disparaged publicly by student demonstrators for many years. But of course, now, after years of the discreditable records of the 2 regimes of a much younger generation, which took power after him, the emperor has been effectively canonized and is currently considered by the people as a veritable saint. The deep sense of loss demonstrated by the public on the occasion of the funeral services for him in Addis Ababa only a couple of years ago was most amazing indeed. The Giz Balakane, or poets, loudly sang for him, Mannu Kamaka Haile Selassie, who can ever be like you, Haile Selassie, in the same streets of Addis Ababa where he was denounced by his students only a few years earlier. Thus, his public image has completely changed beyond recognition. Perhaps 2 most positive things that may be said about the Derg are, I think, that it demolished Ethiopian feudalism from its deepest roots, and that it made credible efforts in the campaign against illiteracy. As for EPDRF, it introduced what appeared to be a modern constitution with all the paraphernalia of guarantees for freedom of speech, freedom of association, an independent judiciary, and a democratic governance in general. But the ethnic federalism on which it is based is hindering its effective application and is engulfing the whole country in a deplorable atmosphere of intolerance, mutual mistrust, personal fear, and among the ordinary people, a debilitating sense of terror similar to that of the Derg days. And in contrast, a stupendous feeling of intransigence and callous arrogance of power among those in government and their associations. This has been dramatically demonstrated in the tragic events immediately following upon the promising elections of 2005, which had clearly drawn the hopes and anxious attention of not only all of us Ethiopians, but the whole world as well. What is even more tragic is that this atmosphere of mistrust and intolerance appears to affect the community of Ethiopians in the wider diaspora. In Europe, as well as here in the United States, Canada, and indeed wherever we may be. The third millennium, the millennium of our youth in particular, is starting today. And it will no longer suffice to angrily shout at your elders, "What have you done with all your time in the past?" It is now time to think what you should do about it yourselves. These days, what saddens and pains me most in my old age is to notice that there is practically no meaningful communication among fellow Ethiopians of different ethnic origins or different faith or different political stands. I had always thought that the most beautiful aspect of Ethiopia was our cultural diversity, and we could have used it positively in our interaction with Americans as well as other fellow immigrant groups. We may belong to different churches, Tawahedo, Catholic, Lutheran, or Pentecostal. We may be Christian or Muslim. We may be practitioners of ancient traditional beliefs. We may speak different languages of our own. We may subscribe to different political parties or movements, but we are in alphabetical order. The proud Ethiopian children of the Afar, the Amhara, the Anuak, the Gummus, the Gurage, the Nuer, the Oromo, the Sidama, the Tigray, the Walaita, and the Ethiopians of all other ethnic origins. Why can't we keep old friendship? Why can't we work together to strengthen our community here and help in the development of truly democratic institutions and a truly democratic governance back in Ethiopia? My brothers and sisters, do let us look around us here in the great city of Chicago and try to take good lessons from the history of the numerous successful communities. All these communities started from scratch, mainly after the Great Fire of Chicago, only since the last 3 decades of the 19th century. But what once used to be very poor and disorganized immigrants from Italy, Poland, Ireland, and even diminutive Lithuania have now developed into very rich and highly successful communities with numerous churches, great buildings, schools, museums, shops, and marketplaces, and special city quarters of their own. And they have become such a great source of pride, not only to themselves, but also to all the people of Chicago in general. Ladies and gentlemen, I must stop here. I apologize for having kept you for so long, and thank you for your patience over the last few very eternal minutes. Malcolm Nkotatash, happy millennium, Malcolm Shamet. Thank you.